The following story contains intense scenes of isolation, suspense, and supernatural horror. Viewer discretion is advised. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen close. The tires of the heavy SUV crunched violently against the hard-packed snow, slipping just enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through Thomas's chest. Outside the frost-crusted windows, the Appalachian wilderness was a blur of gray trunks and white powder. They were climbing high into Blackwood Ridge, a place where the GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, and the radio offered nothing but static. "We should have stopped in the last town," Sarah whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the passenger handle. In the back seat, 10-year-old Leo looked out at the passing trees, his breath fogging the glass. "Dad, the trees look like they're reaching for us," he said, his voice filled with that innocent mix of fear and wonder only children possess. Thomas scoffed, fighting the steering wheel. "It's just trees, Leo. We're going to the ancestral cabin. It's free, it's sturdy, and it's going to save us a fortune this winter. Just relax." But Thomas didn't feel relaxed. The air pressure outside had dropped so low his ears popped. The sky wasn't just gray. It was a bruised, sickly purple, the color of a storm that old-timers talked about in hushed tones. They rounded a sharp bend and finally saw it. The Blackwood cabin. It stood like a dark wooden scar against the pristine snow, made of logs so old they had turned black as coal. Standing on the porch, leaning on a shovel, was a man who looked as weathered as the wood itself. Thomas parked the car and stepped out. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his nose. The old man on the porch didn't smile. He just watched them with eyes that looked like clouded glass. This was Elias, the caretaker who had sent Thomas the key. "You made good time," Elias rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "But the mountain made better time. The storm is here." "We have supplies," Thomas said dismissively, popping the trunk to grab their bags. "We'll be fine for a week." Elias hobbled down the steps, his gaze fixing on young Leo. He grabbed the boy's shoulder, gently, but with a firmness that made Thomas pause. "Listen to me, boy," Elias said, ignoring the parents. "This ridge is old. The wind up here, it don't just blow. It listens." Leo stared at the old man wide-eyed. "Listens?" Elias nodded, looking toward the darkening tree line. "The forecast says snow, but the bones say frost. And when the wind starts singing tonight, you keep your lips sealed. Never whistle at night in these woods. You understand me? If you whistle, it thinks you're calling it. And it will come." Thomas stepped between them, annoyed by the superstition. "All right, that's enough ghost stories, Elias. We appreciate the key." He handed the old man a $20 bill, which Elias refused to take. The caretaker just shook his head, pulled his coat tighter, and began walking down the road toward his own truck. Before he got in, he shouted back one last thing, barely audible over the rising gale. "Lock the heavy bolt, Thomas, and keep the fire hot." By the time they unpacked, the sun had vanished. The darkness of Blackwood Ridge was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to press against the windows. Inside, the cabin was drafty and smelled of pine resin and old dust. Thomas got a fire roaring in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows against the walls. They ate a simple dinner of canned soup, the wind outside beginning to howl with a ferocity that shook the window panes. It wasn't a normal howl. It started low, a deep thrumming bass that vibrated in their chests, then rose to a high, piercing shriek. Sarah was washing dishes in the kitchen when she froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked softly. "Hear what?" Thomas grunted, reading a magazine by the fire. "It sounded like a melody," she whispered. Leo was sitting on the rug, playing with his toy cars. Absent-mindedly, comfortably warm by the fire, he began to purse his lips. He blew a short, cheerful tune, a TV show theme song. Whistle who, whistle who. The wind outside didn't just blow. It stopped. The sudden silence was louder than the storm. For 3 seconds, the world was dead quiet. Then, from right outside the thick oak front door, a sound drifted through the cracks. It was a whistle. Whistle who, whistle who. Perfect mimicry. But the tone was wrong. It sounded hollow, like air blowing through a bare ribcage. Sarah dropped a plate. It shattered on the floor. Leo looked at the door, his face pale. "Dad?" he whispered. Thomas stood up, his skepticism warring with a primal chill running down his spine. He walked to the window and peered out into the blackness. The porch light flickered and died. But in the brief flash before the bulb blew, Thomas thought he saw something standing at the edge of the clearing. It was too tall to be a man, and it was far too thin. "Just the wind," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "Just a draft." But as he turned back to the fire, the heavy iron latch on the front door slowly, painfully, began to lift. The latch is lifting, and the storm has isolated the family completely. The entity outside has heard the call. Thomas lunged across the cabin floor, his boots skidding on the polished wood. He threw his shoulder against the heavy oak door just as the iron latch reached the top of its catch. With a metallic clack, he slammed the deadbolt home and twisted the locking mechanism until his fingers hurt. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, pressing his ear against the cold wood. On the other side, the silence held for a heartbeat, followed by a soft, deliberate thud, like a wet palm slapping against the door. Then, the wind roared back to life, masking whatever had been standing on the porch. "Thomas!" Sarah's voice was trembling from the kitchen. "What was that? Why did the latch move?" "It was just the draft," Thomas lied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the wood. "The wind pressure, it creates a vacuum. Old houses do this. It's fine." He turned to face his family, forcing a tight smile. "Leo, help your mom pick up the plate pieces. I'm gonna check the windows." Leo didn't move immediately. He was staring at the door, his small hands gripping his toy car so tightly the plastic creaked. "I shouldn't have whistled," the boy whispered. "Elias said not to." Thomas walked over and ruffled his son's hair, trying to impart a sense of safety he didn't feel. "Elias is a superstitious old man who likes scaring city folk. Leo, we are safe. This is just a storm." As if to mock his words, a blinding flash of blue-white light exploded outside the window, followed instantly by the sickening crack of a transformer blowing. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness. A second later, the heavy thud of a tree branch hitting the roof shook dust from the rafters. "Stay where you are," Thomas shouted over the sudden darkness. He fumbled in his pockets for his lighter, flicking it on. The small flame danced nervously, illuminating Sarah's terrified face. "The power lines are down," he announced grimly. "We're on the generator backup, but I have to go to the shed to start it." "No!" Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip bruising. "You are not going out there, Thomas. Not tonight. We have the fire. We have blankets. We wait until morning." Thomas looked at the door, thinking of the wet slap he had heard. He nodded slowly. "Okay, fireplace it is. Everyone grab your sleeping bags. We camp in the living room tonight." The next few hours were an exercise in suffocating tension. The fire crackled, casting long, distorting shadows that seemed to stretch and claw at the walls. The temperature in the cabin began to drop rapidly without the electric heating. They huddled together in a nest of blankets, the orange glow of the embers their only light. Outside, the blizzard had become a white wall of fury. Leo, unable to sleep, crawled out of his sleeping bag and crept toward the window facing the backwoods. The frost was beginning to create intricate, fern-like patterns on the glass, but there was a small clear patch in the center. He pressed his face close to the cold pane. The snow was falling so thick it was hypnotic, swirling in chaotic spirals. Then he saw them. At the edge of the clearing, where the forest began, the snow wasn't moving right. Amidst the chaotic white whirlwind, there were three distinct shapes that were perfectly still. They were tall, unnaturally tall, perhaps 7 or 8 feet, and thin as birch saplings. They didn't sway in the wind. They didn't shiver. They just stood there, black silhouettes against the gray snow, facing the cabin. "Dad?" Leo hissed, not daring to speak loud enough for the wind to hear. Thomas, who had been dozing with a poker in his hand, sat up instantly. He crawled over to the window, squinting into the dark. "What is it?" "The tall men," Leo pointed. "They're watching us." Thomas pressed his forehead to the glass. He saw the trees, the snow, the storm. He squinted harder. For a second, he thought he saw what Leo meant, elongated shadows stretching between the pines. But as he focused, a gust of wind blew a sheet of snow across the view. When it cleared, the shapes were gone. "It's just shadows, Leo," Thomas sighed, though his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Trick of the light and the snow." "They didn't have faces," Leo murmured, shivering violently. "Come away from the window," Thomas ordered, pulling the heavy curtains shut with a sharp swish. "No one looks outside anymore. We look at the fire. We listen to the fire." They settled back down, but the mood had shifted from anxiety to dread. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a wooden cage. As the fire burned low, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He realized then that the wind had changed again. It was no longer just howling. It was scraping against the logs, feeling for gaps in the chinking, probing for a way in. And then, from the chimney, the only opening to the outside world that couldn't be locked, came a sound that froze the blood in Thomas's veins. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft, melodic whistling, drifting down the flue, echoing in the hearth. "Whistle who? Whistle who?" It was the exact tune Leo had whistled earlier. But now it sounded closer. The entity is not just outside. It is mocking them from above, using the boys' own innocence against them. The sanctuary of the cabin is already being breached. Thomas scrambled backward from the hearth, gripping the iron poker like a sword. He stared up into the soot-stained darkness of the chimney, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whistling had stopped the moment he moved, replaced by the hollow moan of the wind rushing over the chimney top. "Get back!" he hissed at Sarah and Leo, waving them toward the far corner of the room. He threw a handful of dry kindling onto the dying embers, blowing frantically until flames roared up the flue, desperate to burn away whatever or whoever might be hiding in the stone throat of the cabin. But nothing came down. No soot, no bird, no spirit. Just the smoke rising into the storm. The rest of the night passed in an agonizing blur of sleepless vigilance. Thomas sat in a wooden chair facing the door, the poker across his lap, while Sarah held Leo in a tight embrace on the rug. When morning finally arrived, it didn't bring sunlight. It brought a sickly, gray luminescence that barely penetrated the frosted windows. The snow had piled halfway up the glass, sealing them into a white tomb. The silence of the morning was heavy, broken only by the settling of the cabin's timber. Then the pounding started. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping of a branch or the scratching of an animal. It was a heavy, desperate hammering of a fist against the thick oak of the front door. Thump, thump, thump. Help! For the love of God! Help me! A voice, muffled by the wind and the wood, screamed from the porch. Thomas jumped to his feet, adrenaline surging through his exhausted body. He motioned for Sarah to stay back and crept to the small peephole drilled into the door. Through the distorted glass, he saw a figure huddled in a heavy, tattered coat, covered in a layer of ice so thick it looked like a second skin. The man was shaking the door handle, his face buried in a scarf. "Who is it?" Sarah whispered, standing up, her eyes wide with concern. "I don't know," Thomas whispered back, stepping away from the door. "But we aren't opening it." "Thomas!" Sarah's voice rose, sharp and incredulous. "It's 10 degrees below zero out there. If someone is caught in this, they'll die in minutes. We have to let him in." "We don't know what's out there, Sarah," Thomas snapped, keeping his voice low but intense. "The power is out. The roads are gone. Elias warned us. The whistling last night. Strange things are happening. This could be a trick." The pounding came again, weaker this time. "Please," the voice croaked, sounding wet and ragged. "I'm freezing. I saw your smoke. I can't feel my legs." Sarah pushed past Thomas, her face set in a mask of determination. "I am not going to let a man freeze to death on our doorstep because you're scared of ghost stories." Thomas Hayes. Before he could stop her, she threw the deadbolt and yanked the heavy door open. A wall of freezing air instantly punched into the room, carrying a flurry of snow that hissed as it hit the fire. The stranger collapsed across the threshold, falling to his knees on the floorboards. Sarah struggled against the wind to slam the door shut again, locking it tight. The man on the floor coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his lungs. He slowly pushed himself up. He was tall, unnaturally tall, and as he unraveled the frozen scarf from his face, the family got their first good look at him. He was gaunt, his cheekbones pressing sharply against skin that was a peculiar shade of gray, like wet ash. His eyes were deep-set and pale blue, darting around the room with a hunger that unnerved Thomas instantly. He didn't shiver, despite being covered in snow and ice, despite the claim that he couldn't feel his legs. The man stood up with a fluid, predatory grace that didn't match his condition. "Thank you," the stranger said. His voice was smooth, deeper than it had been through the door. He smiled, revealing teeth that looked slightly too yellow, slightly too long. "My name is Silas. My truck went off the road, miles back. I've been walking for hours." Sarah immediately went into caretaker mode, grabbing a spare blanket from the sofa. "Come sit by the fire, Silas. You must be hypothermic. I'll get you some hot water." She draped the blanket over his shoulders. Silas accepted it, but his eyes didn't look at Sarah. They looked past her, fixing directly on Leo, who was shrinking back against the wall. "A fine boy," Silas murmured, his tongue darting out to wet his dry, cracked lips. "Strong bones." Thomas stepped in front of his son, blocking the stranger's view. He gripped the iron poker tighter, his knuckles white. "You can warm up," Thomas said coldly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But once the storm breaks, you're leaving. We don't have enough food for a guest." Silas turned his pale gaze to Thomas. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he said softly. "I wouldn't want to be a burden. I'm just so very hungry." As Silas moved toward the fire, Thomas looked down at the spot where the man had fallen. The snow that had melted off the stranger's boots hadn't turned into clear puddles of water. The liquid on the floor was dark, viscous, and smelled faintly of copper and rot. Thomas looked back at the man warming his hands over the flames. Silas wasn't shivering. He wasn't rubbing his arms for warmth. He was just standing there, absorbing the heat, staring into the fire as if he were remembering something ancient and terrible. Thomas realized then that Sarah's kindness might have just invited the winter's curse right into their living room. The stranger is inside. He is physically wrong, and Thomas has noticed the dark residue he leaves behind. The cabin is no longer a fortress. It is a trap. The presence of Silas changed the air in the cabin. It wasn't just the smell. A faint, earthy odor like wet soil and old copper. It was the heaviness he brought. He sat by the fire, his long limbs folded awkwardly like a spider trying to hide in a matchbox. He didn't move, didn't speak, and barely seemed to blink. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the flames, but every time Thomas or Leo moved, Silas's head would snap toward them with unnerving speed, tracking their motion like a predator watching prey scurry through the grass. By mid-afternoon, the storm outside had buried the first-floor windows completely. The cabin was now a dimly lit cave, illuminated only by the fire and a few battery-operated lanterns. Sarah, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, went to the small pantry closet adjacent to the kitchen to prepare a meal. "I'll open some cans of stew," she announced, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "And we have that fresh bread we bought in town." A moment later, a sharp gasp echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of a metal can hitting the floor. Thomas was out of his chair in a second, rushing to his wife's side. Sarah was standing in front of the open pantry, her hand over her mouth, staring at the shelves in horror. The supplies they had bought just yesterday, fresh loaves of bread, bags of apples, boxes of crackers, were ruined. The bread was a slumped mass of gray-green mold. The apples had collapsed into black, oozing rot, dripping a sticky liquid onto the floorboards. Even the unopened cans of soup looked wrong. The metal was bulging outward, distended as if the contents inside were boiling or fermenting violently. "How is this possible?" Sarah whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "It's freezing in here. This should have been preserved. It looks like it's been rotting for years." From the living room, Silas's voice drifted in, smooth and cold. "The frost doesn't preserve everything, ma'am. Sometimes it accelerates the hunger. The mountain. It eats the life out of things before it freezes them." Thomas spun around, his patience snapping. "What do you know about it?" he demanded, marching back into the living room. Silas turned his head slowly, a grim smile stretching his thin lips. "I know the history of this ridge. I know why the cabin was built." He gestured to the dark corners of the room. "In the winter of 1899, a blizzard just like this one struck. The mining families were trapped for 3 months. They ran out of food in the first week. Leo, who was huddled under a blanket, looked up fearfully. What did they eat?" Silas's eyes locked onto the boy. "At first they ate their leather boots. Then they boiled the bark from the trees. But the hunger here isn't normal. It's a spirit. The Ojibwe call it the Wendigo. The locals just call it the hungry frost. It rides the wind, and it enters a man's heart when he is starving. It makes him look at his neighbors, his friends, even his family, as meat." "That's enough," Thomas barked, stepping between Silas and his son. "Stop scaring the boy. We aren't starving. We have emergency rations in the back." But Thomas felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He turned back to the kitchen to inspect the damage more closely. He grabbed a rag and wiped away the black ooze dripping from the pantry shelf. That's when he saw it. The pantry was a small closet, barely 2 feet deep. The door had been latched shut until Sarah opened it. Yet, on the middle shelf, amidst the rotting apples, there was a footprint. It wasn't a boot print. It was the print of a bare human foot. But it was wrong. The toes were too long, splayed out wide, and the impression was made of a thick, gray sludge that matched the color of Silas's skin. Thomas froze. The pantry was locked. Silas had been by the fire the entire time. There was no way a full-grown man could fit on that shelf, let alone leave a wet footprint there without opening the door. He looked back into the living room. Silas was watching him. The stranger brought a hand to his mouth and picked something out of his teeth. A small, dark seed, like an apple seed. He flicked it into the fire, where it popped with a hiss. "You should check the cellar, Thomas," Silas said softly, knowing exactly what Thomas had found without even looking. "The old ones used to keep the special meat down there. Maybe there's something left." Thomas realized with a jolt of terror that the rot wasn't an accident. Something was in the cabin with them, something that could pass through locked doors, something that corrupted whatever it touched. And the stranger by the fire wasn't just a victim of the storm. He was the harbinger of it. The food is gone. The supernatural presence has been confirmed physically inside a locked space. Silas is beginning to toy with them, revealing his knowledge of the special meat. Day 3 of the blizzard was the coldest yet, but the true threat now was not the outside temperature. It was the psychological climate within the cabin. The constant, gnawing hunger, coupled with Silas's unnerving presence, had frayed Thomas's nerves until they were nearly bare. He felt an intense, irrational anger directed at everyone. At Sarah for letting the stranger in, at Leo for whistling, and most intensely, at Silas for simply existing. Thomas knew this rage was unnatural, a corrosive cabin fever eating away at his reason. Yet he couldn't stop himself from snapping at every slight sound. "You use too much wood," Thomas hissed at Sarah late that afternoon, watching her place a small log onto the fire. "We need to ration. We don't know how long this will last." Sarah looked at him, her eyes tired and defensive. "It's 10 degrees inside, Thomas. Leo is shivering. This cabin is freezing even with the fire. Stop watching every little thing we do." Silas watched this exchange from his corner, his gray face impassive, a hint of something dark and satisfied gleaming in his pale eyes. The way Silas observed them, like a scientist watching bacteria divide under a microscope, stoked Thomas's internal fire. He saw Silas's smile, and suddenly, his mind twisted the image. "He's starving us. He's taking the food and the heat so we break, so we turn on each other." The old stories said the spirit feeds on the discord, feeds on the greed. A fierce, cold urge to strike the stranger, to remove the source of the tension, began to pulse behind Thomas's eyes. Night brought a new, terrifying intensity to the haunting. They were all huddled near the hearth when the sounds began again. This time, it wasn't a sudden, isolated whistle from the chimney. It was a low, vibrational humming that seemed to resonate from the very foundation of the cabin. It was everywhere at once, a deep, sustained chord that felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure inside their skulls. "It's not outside," Leo whispered, pointing a shaky finger toward the thick log wall by his head. "It's in the wood." Thomas pressed his ear against the rough timber. Beneath the deep humming, he could distinctly hear the sound of whistling. Multiple whistles, layered one atop the other, weaving complex, discordant melodies. And then he heard the scratching. It was sharp and dry, like long, unclipped fingernails being dragged slowly across the inner bark. The sound was moving, traveling horizontally just beneath the chinking, racing back and forth between the logs. As the sound raced past him, Thomas heard something specific, something horrifyingly familiar. The layered whistles momentarily coalesced into a precise, echoing imitation of the short, cheerful tune Leo had whistled on the first night. The sound was now using the cabin's structure like a resonating chamber, proving it had fully infested their sanctuary. The sheer violation of their safe space snapped the last thread of Thomas's control. He jumped away from the wall, rage flooding his system. He grabbed the iron poker, his breathing ragged. "It's you!" he roared, pointing the smoking iron at Silas. "You brought it here. You're whistling. You're doing this." Silas, who hadn't moved a muscle, looked up at Thomas's charging figure. He didn't look threatened. He looked disappointed, like a master whose student failed an easy test. As Thomas swung the poker, aiming for the man's shoulder, Silas simply extended one long, gray hand. He caught the iron shaft in his grip, effortlessly without moving his feet, and the heavy metal weapon stopped dead in the air, vibrating violently. "Patience, Thomas," Silas said, his voice quiet, almost a lullaby. The strength radiating from his grip was colossal. "The hungry frost doesn't need to whistle. It has already taught you the tune." Silas gave a gentle twist of his wrist. The iron poker spun out of Thomas's paralyzed hand, clattering harmlessly onto the hearthstones. Thomas staggered back, breathing heavily, watching the man he had tried to kill. He saw the cold triumph in Silas's eyes and finally understood the insidious nature of the curse. It wasn't just physical hunger. It was the dark craving for violence and selfish survival the mountain spirit instilled. Thomas retreated to the corner, shaking not from cold, but from self-loathing. He had almost killed a man. A suspicious, pale man, yes, but a man nonetheless in front of his wife and son. He had become the thing Elias warned them about, the man who turns against his own. As the whistling and scratching continued its frantic pace inside the walls, Silas chuckled, a dry, cold sound like cracking ice. The entity was satisfied. It had found purchase in Thomas's heart. Thomas has confirmed Silas's unnatural strength and his own susceptibility to rage. He is fighting a war in his own mind now. What secret knowledge does the cabin hold that could fight this internal corruption? The silence that followed Thomas's outburst was heavier than the storm outside. He sat on the floor, head in his hands, the shame of his violence burning hotter than the dying fire. Silas had returned to his vigil by the hearth, his posture relaxed, humming a low, tuneless vibration that seemed to keep the scratching inside the walls at bay, or perhaps in check. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls leaning in, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Sarah, shaken but determined to keep her family from freezing, began tearing up the rotting floorboards in the corner of the room to feed the fire. They had run out of chopped wood, and the furniture was too heavy to break without tools. She wedged a screwdriver into a gap near the skirting board and pried upward. With a groan of rusted nails, a section of the wide pine plank popped loose. Beneath the board, nestled in the dusty insulation of dried moss and sawdust, lay a small, rectangular object wrapped in brittle oilcloth. Sarah paused, her breath catching in her throat. She reached down into the dark crawlspace and pulled it out. It was a book, bound in cracked black leather, cold enough to burn her fingertips. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice cutting through the gloom. "Look at this." Thomas looked up, his eyes dull. He crawled over to her, Leo following close behind. They unwrapped the cloth. Embossed on the cover were the initials J.H. Jeremiah Hayes, Thomas's great-grandfather, the man who had built this cabin. The pages were stiff and yellowed, smelling of mildew and old despair. Sarah opened it to the last entry, dated December 24th, 1899. "Read it," Thomas said, a sudden dread gripping his stomach. Sarah squinted in the firelight and began to read aloud. Her voice trembled, echoing strangely in the quiet room. "The snow has not stopped for 40 days. The children are silent. The food is gone. I have done a terrible thing. I went to the ridge tonight and I whistled into the dark, as the old medicine woman warned me never to do. I called to the hunger. I offered it a trade. Sarah paused, looking at Thomas with wide, fearful eyes before continuing. It appeared as a man of ice and wind, promised us survival, promised the snow would melt and the deer would return. In exchange, I promised it a share of my harvest, not of corn or of wheat, but of my blood. It said it would return for its due when the winter was hardest again. I have saved my children today, but I have damned my grandchildren. May God forgive me. The room fell deathly silent. The scratching in the walls stopped completely. The realization washed over Thomas like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't a random haunt. This wasn't bad luck. They had been lured here. The free vacation at the ancestral cabin, the historic blizzard, it was all a debt collection more than a century in the making. Silas shifted in his chair. The sound of his movement was like dry bones rattling. Jeremiah was a desperate man, Silas said softly, staring into the flames. He wanted to live. He wanted his family to live. He made a deal with the Wendigo spirit. Silas turned his head slowly, fixing his pale gaze on Thomas. But spirits do not understand time like we do. Promise made in blood never expires. It waits. You, Thomas stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the stranger. You aren't just a traveler. You knew. You're him. I am merely a vessel, Silas replied, his voice devoid of emotion. The spirit needs a body to speak. It needs a voice to collect. Your great-grandfather invited the cold into his heart to save his life. Now, the cold has come back to claim what was promised. He gestured vaguely toward Leo. The harvest Jeremiah promised was the future of his line. Sarah pulled Leo into her lap, wrapping her arms around him so tightly the boy squeaked. You will not touch him, she snarled, a mother's primal fury overriding her fear. I don't care about some 100-year-old pact. You will not touch my son. Silas didn't attack. He simply smiled, a sad, knowing expression. The deal was for blood. It doesn't have to be the boy, but the mountain must be fed. One heart must freeze so the others may thaw. Thomas looked at the journal, then at his terrified son, and finally at the gray-skinned stranger. The truth was out. The evil wasn't invading. It was invited. The curse was an inheritance, just like the cabin. And like any inheritance, you couldn't just refuse it when the bill came due. The scratching in the walls returned, louder now, sounding like applause. The stakes are clear. The entity wants a life from the Hayes bloodline to fulfill the pact. The stranger is the debt collector. The family is trapped by history. The revelation of the journal hung in the air like smoke, choking the remaining hope out of the room. Silas did not speak again. He simply closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the chair, a posture of serene waiting. The fire finally sputtered and died, reducing the room to a box of shadows. Thomas tried to keep his eyes open, to keep watch over his family, but a heavy, supernatural lethargy pressed down on his eyelids. It wasn't normal exhaustion. It was the winter slumber, a spell cast by the freezing air to lower the heart rate and numb the mind. Against his will, Thomas's chin dropped to his chest, and he drifted into a cold, black doze. He awoke to the sound of slamming wood. The noise echoed like a gunshot in the silent cabin. Thomas jerked upright, his breath misting heavily in the air. The temperature inside had plummeted. It was now as cold inside as it was out. He looked frantically to the rug where Sarah and Leo had been huddled. Sarah was stirring, groggy and confused, pushing herself up from the floor. But the space next to her, The small nest of blankets where Leo had been sleeping was empty. "Leo?" Thomas croaked, his voice cracking with panic. He scrambled to his feet, spinning around. The chair by the hearth was empty too. Silas was gone. A draft of freezing wind cut across the room, carrying snowflakes that danced mockingly in the gloom. Thomas followed the current of air to the back of the cabin. The heavy wooden door, which led to the rear woods and the steepest drop of the ridge, was standing wide open. It swayed gently on its hinges, creaking in rhythm with the gale outside. "Thomas!" Sarah screamed, realizing her son was gone. She scrambled toward the open door, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the table. Thomas was right behind her. They spilled out onto the back porch, the beam of light cutting through the swirling white chaos. There, in the fresh powder on the porch steps, were two sets of tracks. One set belonged to large, bare feet, long and distorted, sinking deep into the snow. Beside them were small, frantic boot prints. The tracks didn't look like Leo had been dragged. They looked like he had walked. They led away from the safety of the cabin, straight into the black maw of the pine forest. He lured him, Thomas realized with a sick lurch of his stomach. He whistled, and Leo followed. Without a word, Thomas and Sarah plunged into the storm. The snow was waist-deep in places, a physical barrier that seemed to fight them. As they pushed forward, the wilderness transformed into a nightmare landscape. The trees, coated in thick ice, bent low over the path, their branches looking like skeletal fingers reaching down to snatch the parents up. The wind roared in their ears, sounding less like air and more like 1,000 whispering voices mocking their despair. "Leo! Leo!" Sarah screamed, her voice tearing from her throat, only to be swallowed instantly by the wind. Thomas grabbed her arm to steady her as she stumbled. He shone the light ahead. The snow itself seemed to be alive. As the wind whipped the drifts, the white powder formed momentary, terrifying shapes. Grasping hands rising from the ground, faces screaming in silence before dissolving back into the blizzard. It was as if the mountain itself was trying to confuse them, to turn them around so they would lose the path and freeze alongside their son. "Keep your eyes on the tracks," Thomas shouted over the gale, shielding his face. "Don't look at the trees. Look at the ground." They fought their way up the ridge, lungs burning, limbs growing heavy with the creeping frost. The cold was a physical weight, a predator sinking its teeth into their skin. But the terror of losing their child provided a fire that the winter couldn't extinguish. They crested a small hill and saw it, a faint, blue glow pulsing in the distance, coming from the mouth of an old mining cave that had been sealed for decades. The tracks led straight into the dark throat of the earth. The whistling was coming from inside now, loud, triumphant, and terrifyingly clear. The parents have left the safety of the cabin and entered the spirit's domain. Leo is in the cave with the entity. The final confrontation is approaching. Thomas and Sarah stepped across the threshold of the mine shaft, leaving the roaring chaos of the blizzard behind. Instantly, the howling wind vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it made their ears ring. The air inside the cave wasn't just cold. It was ancient, a stagnant, freezing vapor that tasted of metallic ore and dried blood. The walls of the tunnel were lined with thick, jagged icicles that pointed inward like thousands of crystal spears. Following the faint, pulsating blue light, they moved deeper into the mountain, their footsteps echoing loudly on the stone floor. They rounded a sharp corner and entered a massive, cavernous chamber. In the center, illuminated by the supernatural blue glow emanating from the ice itself, was Leo. He was standing perfectly still on a raised slab of granite, his eyes wide open but unseeing, staring blankly into the darkness. He looked like a statue carved from wax, a layer of frost coating his eyelashes and hair. "Leo!" Sarah cried out, her voice breaking the stillness. She ran toward him, ignoring the treacherous ice that coated the floor. She reached the slab and grabbed his shoulders, shaking him frantically. "Leo, wake up! Mommy is here!" But Leo didn't blink. His skin was ice-cold to the touch, and his breathing was so shallow it was invisible. He was trapped in the winter sleep, his life force slowly being siphoned away into the stone beneath him. "He is dreaming of warmth," a voice boomed from the shadows behind the slab. "Let him sleep. It is a kinder way to go." Thomas raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal Silas standing atop a pile of rubble and old mining gear. But it wasn't the Silas they knew. The disguise of humanity was melting away. His gray skin had split open like a husk, revealing a body underneath that seemed made of translucent, blue-veined ice. His fingers had elongated into terrible, jagged claws, and his eyes were no longer human. They were burning voids of cold white light, like dying stars. "You monster!" Thomas growled, stepping forward to stand between the creature and his family. "Let him go. Take me instead if you want a life. He's just a child." The entity threw its head back and laughed, a sound like a glacier cracking apart. "I do not want just a life, Thomas Hayes. I want a heart." The spirit hissed, its voice sounding like grinding stones. "Your ancestor, Jeremiah, promised me the harvest. He traded his future for a few more years of breath. I am merely collecting the interest on that loan." Silas, or the thing wearing his name, stepped down from the rubble. He moved with a terrifying, jerky motion, as if his joints were frozen solid. He towered over Thomas, easily 7 feet tall now. "The boy is pure," the spirit continued, circling them slowly. "His heart is full of hope. That is a rare delicacy in the winter. But your heart is different. It is blackened by selfishness. It is cracked by anger." Thomas stood his ground, though his knees shook violently. He realized the creature was right. He had spent the last few days, perhaps the last few years, being angry, cynical, and distant. He had let the cold into his heart long before they arrived at Blackwood Ridge. The spirit wasn't just a physical monster. It was a mirror reflecting Thomas's own internal failures. "You can't have him," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had left, a heavy silver lighter. It was a small, pathetic weapon against a demon of ice, but it was a symbol of the one thing the spirit hated: fire. "The deal was for blood," Thomas said, flicking the lighter open. The small flame sputtered to life, casting a warm, defiant orange glow against the overwhelming blue. "You said you needed a sacrifice, so let's make a new deal," the spirit hissed, recoiling slightly from the tiny flame. It looked at Thomas with a mixture of hunger and curiosity. "You wish to bargain? Like your grandfather?" The creature grinned, revealing a maw of needle-sharp icicles. "Very well. I love a wager. But be warned, Thomas. The cold always wins in the end." Thomas has challenged the spirit. He is using the symbol of warmth, fire, and his own willingness to sacrifice to stall the entity. The final test of his character is about to begin. The tiny flame dancing atop Thomas's silver lighter was the only warmth in the cavern. Yet it held the attention of the colossal ice entity. The Wendigo spirit, through Silas's horrific vessel, leaned in, the blue light of its eyes boring into Thomas. "You offer a life, Thomas," the creature rasped, its voice a dry, echoing whisper. "But I know your heart. You are not willing to freeze for your family. You only wish to survive." The spirit raised one enormous, clawed hand. The blue glow in the cave intensified until it was blinding. "I offer you a counter-wager," the spirit boomed. "You honor the debt, but you do not pay with your life. You pay with your bond. Walk away, Thomas. Leave the others to their fate. The storm will lift for you immediately. The bank will call. You will be successful, wealthy, and eternally warm." Suddenly, the cold vanished. Thomas was no longer in the cave. He stood on a sunny beach, the air thick with the smell of salt and money. He wore a linen suit and a beautiful younger version of Sarah, one untouched by the worry and hardness of their current life, smiled at him from a deck chair. A fancy car gleamed nearby. His father's debts were gone. His business was thriving. The vision was intoxicating, a dream woven from every financial anxiety and selfish desire Thomas had ever harbored. "This is true warmth," the spirit whispered, the sound now coming from inside Thomas's mind. "This is what you deserve. A life where you are never cold, never hungry, never shamed by failure. The boy? He is a liability. Your marriage? It is tired. Leave the burden. Take the fortune. Be the man your great-grandfather wanted to be. Rich, warm, and alive." The image showed Thomas sipping a cocktail, utterly relaxed, completely free. But as the seductive vision played out, the physical reality of the cave began to intrude. A chilling, aching sensation gripped his legs. He glanced down. Where the vision showed expensive leather shoes, the reality was stark. A thick, creeping layer of hard white frost was growing rapidly up his worn jeans. It had covered his boots and was climbing past his knees, turning the fabric brittle and black. "Thomas, don't listen to it." Sarah's voice, raw with desperation, managed to pierce the illusion. She was kneeling by Leo, fighting to keep her eyes open against the icy glare. "It's a lie. That life isn't real. We need you." The sound of Sarah's genuine, terrified voice sliced through the vision's artificial warmth. Thomas looked away from the tempting sunlit beach. He looked at the face of his wife, haggard, frostbitten but utterly real, and then at his son, frozen on the stone altar. He saw the truth. The life the spirit offered was perfect because it was empty. It was wealth without cost, warmth without love, a hollow existence built on abandonment. The frost was now reaching his hips, tightening around his muscles like iron bands. He felt the cold reaching for his internal organs. He lifted the silver lighter, holding the small, fragile flame high above the creeping ice. "I reject the wager," Thomas said, his voice slow and heavy, shaking not with fear, but with monumental conviction. "The debt will be paid, but not by betrayal. My greed ends here." He flicked the lighter wider, pushing the small flame toward the spirit, a defiant, tiny torch in the cavern of ice. "You want a heart? You want a life? Take the heart that failed my family, the life that was too selfish to provide for them. I pay the debt." The spirit's pale eyes widened in genuine shock, the blue light flickering like a faulty bulb. "Fool!" the creature screamed, the sound vibrating the crystals on the cave walls. "You choose the cold over comfort. You choose death over life." It lunged forward, the ice claws aimed not at his heart, but at the tiny, protective flame in Thomas's hand. Thomas has chosen sacrifice. The spirit, enraged by the loss of its expected greed-filled victim, is attacking. The climax is here. Can Thomas use the fire, the symbol of love, to defeat the cold debt? The towering spirit of the hungry frost lunged at Thomas, its ice claws aiming for the tiny, defiant flame. The immense force of its movement whipped the frigid air, threatening to extinguish the little silver lighter entirely. Thomas did not flinch. He pressed the flame forward, closing his eyes, focusing not on the heat of the fire, but on the blinding, consuming warmth of the love he felt for his family. The love he had nearly let selfishness and greed kill. He whispered Sarah's name, and then Leo's, accepting his frozen fate but refusing to submit to the monster's terms. As the spirit's claws reached the flame, something impossible happened. The tiny orange fire didn't burn the monster, but the purity of the sacrifice behind it seemed to scald the entity. The spirit shrieked, a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once, and recoiled violently. It was a creature of cold, born of the absence of life and the corruption of the hungry human heart. Could not withstand the sudden, absolute presence of true, selfless warmth. "The debt is paid," Thomas gasped, as the frost reached his chest, his heart slowing, ready to stop. The terrifying blue light inside the cavern pulsed one last, blinding time. The Wendigo spirit tore itself out of the Silas vessel, a shimmering, serpentine shape of pure blue frost that rushed upward and vanished through a crack in the cave, sealing with a final, defeated whine. The colossal body of the vessel Silas crumbled to the stone floor. The ice that had defined his horrifying form dissolved instantly, leaving behind the pale, gaunt body of a man who looked centuries old, his face locked in a final expression of utter emptiness. The moment the spirit left, the supernatural cold retreated. The oppressive, freezing pressure lifted instantly. Leo blinked, his eyes clear now, and looked down at his mother. "Mommy?" he whispered, his voice weak but real. Sarah collapsed onto him, sobbing uncontrollably as the frost coating his small body melted away into harmless moisture. Thomas, whose legs and chest had been entirely encased in ice just a moment before, felt a surge of painful, fiery heat rush back into his limbs. He staggered over to his family, dropping the lighter onto the cave floor. He was physically shattered and exhausted, but spiritually whole. They held each other in the center of the cavern, the only warmth they needed, while around them, the rest of the mountain's cursed ice continued to melt with impossible speed. They stumbled out of the mine shaft hours later, guided by a weak winter sun that had suddenly broken through the clouds. The storm was gone. The world outside Blackwood Ridge was silent and startlingly bright. The sky was a sharp, brilliant blue, and the snow was already beginning to melt. They walked only a few yards before they heard the distant roar of engines and saw the flicker of emergency lights. Elias, the old caretaker, had returned with a search party, having found the abandoned SUV. Days later, Thomas and Sarah sat in a warm hospital room, watching Leo play quietly with his restored toy cars. They were bruised, frostbitten, and shaken, but they were alive. They had sold the Blackwood cabin instantly, accepting a loss on the price just to be rid of the property. As they finally drove away from the ridge a week later, heading back toward the city and the harsh reality of their normal lives, Thomas gripped the steering wheel tight. They passed the sign for Blackwood Ridge. He refused to look back at the dark, solitary cabin. "We paid the price," Sarah murmured, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We broke the curse." Thomas nodded, but a chill that had nothing to do with the car's ventilation crept up his spine. He remembered Elias's warning, the journal's account, and the terrifying force of the mountain. He knew the hungry frost was not vanquished. It was only resting, waiting for the next time the snow fell thick and the human heart turned cold. Just as they passed the last bend, the faint, clear sound of a perfect musical note drifted down from the pine trees high on the ridge. Whistle-hoo. It was barely audible, swallowed almost immediately by the sound of the engine. But it was there, a soft, unsettling reminder that when dealing with the ancient folklore of the American wilderness, you never truly win. You only survive until the next winter calls. Nature and the ancient forces that govern it can never be fully tamed by man. We must maintain caution and respect the legends, for the only thing keeping the evil at bay is the warmth we carry in our hearts.